Alright guys, so in this video, I am going to be discussing a possible situation regarding the ACC. Obviously, all eyes on that conference this summer with possibly 2, 4, maybe 6 teams leaving the conference. Is this a similar situation to the Pac-12 where the entire conference gets wiped off the map, or could it potentially be different? I do think it very likely is different because I just don't see a path to joining other conferences for most of these teams in the ACC, especially after Cal and Stanford, along with SMU, got added to the conference. And I maintain the prediction, as I said in prior months, that I think the ACC will be a de facto, group of five type power when it comes to the future of college football, at least the immediate future. We might have a huge shakeup with all of this realignment that's happening within the next 4 or 5 years, but just based off of this summer alone, it'll really depend how many teams actually leave. There are a few wild cards like North Carolina and Miami. We know Clemson, FSU, they've come out. They said they want to leave. Just looking at every team in the ACC at this point, I'm just going to kind of go down the line and talk about probably the 7 or 8 teams that I see likely staying in the conference no matter what. Another wild card could be the Big 12. Would the Big 12 want any of these teams? It's interesting to talk about, but I think the Big 12 doesn't really want to dilute themselves anymore. Either way, when you look at a team like Boston College starting there on the far left, I don't really see a path for Boston College to go anywhere. I don't think the Big 12 wants them. Obviously, the SEC and the Big 10 are not going to have an appetite, so I think they stay in the ACC or whatever is left of the conference. California is a very interesting one because I have seen a lot on California in terms of their attractiveness being in California, the academics, but them joining the ACC, I really don't see them leaving the conference, although there were initial rumors, they were possibly going to be part of the West Wing along with Stanford. The Big Ten may be valuing the academics. Right now, it looks like that's not going to happen, so I would say Cal is probably going to stay in the ACC or whatever is left of it. Obviously, in a situation like this, you would have Clemson very likely leaving the conference. They would be gone to the SEC or the Big Ten. Duke is another wild card that I really have no clue what's going to happen to Duke, honestly, because of the North Carolina factor, that rivalry. Would they really separate that, with a different conference? Obviously, if the money is right for North Carolina, there's been rumors they're possibly the most attractive team for either the Big Ten or the SEC, even more so than Clemson and FSU when you factor in the basketball side of things along with the prestige of the academics of their program. But in this scenario, I would say Duke probably stays in the ACC or whatever is left of it. FSU in this scenario would leave, obviously. Georgia Tech, I think, stays, even though the Atlanta area, you could argue maybe the Big Ten would be interested. Maybe the Big 12 would be interested. But again, in this scenario, I'm going to say Georgia Tech stays. Louisville would be a team that would probably leave to either the SEC or the Big Ten, but probably more so the SEC. It'll depend. Miami is a team that in this scenario I would think would leave the ACC. If you're talking about 5 or 6 teams leaving, Miami would be one of them, possibly to the Big Ten. North Carolina is another team that would leave. NC State is possibly tied at the hip to North Carolina. In this scenario, I would say they would probably leave. Pittsburgh, I think, would possibly go to the Big 12, honestly. I think Pittsburgh's a very good fit in the Big 12. SMU, I don't think they're going anywhere. Stanford at this point, they would probably try and go to the Big Ten, but they're probably not going anywhere. Syracuse, you could maybe argue the Big 12, although who really knows? Virginia, I think, stays. I know people say, well, they're academics, they're basketball. I don't see it happening in the Big Ten. Virginia Tech, I think, also probably stays as well. And then Wake Forest. The two bottom feeders right now, I would say, in the ACC are Wake Forest and Boston College. Those two teams where if you had a Pac-12 situation, if you're looking for the two teams that get left behind, like Washington State and Oregon State, it would be Wake Forest and Boston College. But let's just say the ACC, they lose a bunch of teams and they're left with Boston College, Cal, Duke, Georgia Tech, SMU, Stanford, Syracuse, Virginia Tech, Wake Forest. How do they replace, 4 or 5, maybe even 6 teams? You can see this has been a thing I've looked at before. Group of 5 teams most likely to join in conference realignment. This would be a situation, I think, if the ACC loses all of those teams, because of the current situation with Stanford and with Cal being on the West Coast, they're going to for sure add San Diego State. At least we would think. Now, San Diego State has been rumored to the Big 12 for a few years. It hasn't happened. So maybe you could argue San Diego State, they might not want to join, but I would think San Diego State would possibly join the ACC. It is also important to note, you also have to wonder, when it comes to the TV deal the ACC currently has, what happens to it if all of these teams break through and leave the conference? You also do have UNLV. I would probably move UNLV down a little bit. I think the ACC would take San Diego State, Memphis, possibly Boise State. Boise State has a very good program. Their market size is extremely small. I do think they'd be interested in South Florida. Colorado State and Fresno State, maybe. But I would say the top options for the ACC, you would definitely take San Diego State, Memphis, Boise State, and South Florida. If you needed 4, maybe even more teams as kind of fillers for the teams that you could potentially lose, and you're also looking at a situation where you want another team on the West Coast, you're probably looking at Oregon State over Washington State if you want to take one of those two teams, in my opinion, because those two teams I'm sure would be fine with joining even a watered-down ACC, because I think that's definitely a scenario we could look at. We could also see maybe just 2 teams leaving the ACC. Remember what happened to the Big 12? They lost their 2 big dogs, but they were able to replace them. Maybe the ACC loses 2 of their big dogs, and they're able to replace them. I don't know, but I do think this is a domino effect to where if those 2 teams can break out of the contract, there's going to be other teams that do it as well, because it's such a bad TV deal for the upper echelon teams in that conference. It's really not a bad TV deal for a Wake Forest, a Boston College, teams of that nature, but for the teams that really bring in good ratings, it is horrible. That's why they're trying to break through it, and that's why I think for sure FSU, Clemson, you look at North Carolina, we'll see what happens with NC State if they're tied to North Carolina, and then on top of that, teams like Miami, possibly rumored to the Big Ten. There's some interesting stuff. So the ACC, I think, is a different situation than the Pac-12 because the ACC was a lot more proactive than the Pac-12. The Pac-12, we all know, had a chance to possibly go on the offense back in 2021 when the Big 12 was reeling. They could have potentially taken a few teams. It was rumored. They didn't do it. And we see the ACC, this has been kind of simmering at the surface really ever since realignment kicked off back in 2021 with how bad this TV deal is. At some point, you're going to see a lot of these upper tier ACC teams really bang on the wall and try and get out of here, considering, they're locked in through 2036. They're just not going to stand that, and they're going to band together and try and do something to get out of it, and I'm sure it's going to happen. It's just the way it works, whether it's lawyers through legal loopholes or something else. These teams are not going to be making this amount of money through 2036, for over a decade. It's not going to happen. It's not an option for them. So they will get out. And I would also say North Carolina is very likely to get out. Miami, even after Clemson and FSU. I know those have been the top 2 teams, which again would signal that the ACC, if they want to stay together as a conference, which I think they probably could, you could also make an argument that if the Big 12 really wanted to, like the Big 10, does it really make sense for them to add anyone else from the ACC? And same thing with the SEC. Outside of Clemson, FSU, North Carolina, and then maybe Louisville, is any other team in that conference really attractive enough for the Big 10 to possibly dilute some of their members by bringing another team on board? Honestly, I doubt it. So it's going to come down to the Big 12 and what they want to do. Does the Big 12 want to go on the offense? I think Louisville could be a good fit in the Big 12, but I really don't think Louisville wants to join the Big 12. Right now, they've got a very similar TV situation in terms of the amount of money they're making per year with the ACC. Obviously, the Big 12 is in like a healthier spot in terms of staying together. The ACC, there's a lot of unknowns, and that's what we're really watching this summer. But Louisville, it'll just depend on if the top of the conference gets poached completely. I think Louisville could potentially leave. I don't know if they'd go to the Big 12, but the Big 12 candidates for me would be like Pittsburgh would be a team I could see going to the Big 12. I know the Big 12 wants some academics, maybe Virginia, maybe a team like Virginia Tech. Those seem like viable fits for the Big 12 as well. I know the Big 12's dream is like Miami. At least that was the rumor that I heard back in the winter. And you can understand why. I don't think Miami would really want to go to the Big 12, but Honestly, it'd be kind of attractive for Miami. There's a lot of upside in the Big 12. Not that it really matters anymore. I mean, you can't even predict what the playoff is going to be in 5 years. It might be up to, 18 teams, so maybe it doesn't really matter if you lose 4 or 5 games, you're still going to get in. But Miami might see the Big 12 as a little bit of an upside, an easier schedule. You're not facing any of the big dogs. If you join the Big 10 or the SEC, it's going to be very hard to compete in those leagues. So that would be kind of funny if they actually did join the Big 12, Miami, but I don't think they would, especially if they get an invite from the Big 10 or the SEC. Obviously, it's a massive pay bump over what the Big 12 would be offering. And then you also do have a team like Duke. I'm sure the Big 12 would be interested. I'm not sure Duke would really go there. I could see Duke staying in a watered-down ACC, which is a legitimate scenario I could see playing out if Clemson, FSU, teams like North Carolina are able to break free and possibly join either the SEC or the Big 10. The question is how many teams get out, and is the Big 12 interested in taking kind of those middle-of-the-pack teams just like they did when the Pac-12 completely got destroyed? Because if the Big 12 wasn't interested, the Pac-12 would still be together more as a watered-down conference, because a lot of those teams, would the Big 10 really take Arizona? Would the SEC take Arizona? They wouldn't. But the Big 12 did. So the Big 12 is really the team that could completely destroy the ACC if they wanted to really expand their conference, but doesn't really make sense. Possibly if they want some teams that are good in terms of analytics. I know you could also say with the Big 12 could just take San Diego State. I don't know. I could see a scenario where the ACC, and this is what the scenario would be, they lose some teams. They have about 8 or 9 teams, and then they're able to supplement it and add a San Diego State, add a Memphis, maybe add a UNLV, although I don't think that would add much. Boise State would potentially add a lot, along with South Florida, and they're getting a new stadium, which would help them in terms of attractiveness for a conference like the ACC. And the ACC becomes a de facto group of 5 conference with the situation possibly playing out that way. So it's interesting to think about the ACC. Do they completely dissolve? Are they blown up? Or could we see a scenario because they added 3 teams, Stanford, Cal, and SMU? Again, the whole Stanford, Cal thing is really weird. Stanford and Cal are attractive programs. The Big 10, there were a lot of people that thought Stanford and Cal were going to be members of the Big 10. It didn't happen. They joined the ACC. And now they're kind of in a weird spot where they're the only 2 teams out west part of this conference. This conference is really on edge right now. Yes, they have a TV deal. It's not good. And there's the top teams trying to get out of it. But where does that leave Stanford and Cal? Obviously, SMU, you could say, worst case scenario for them. I think SMU is an up-and-coming program. They would fit great in the Big 12. I don't know if the Big 12 would want them, but they would fit really good in the Big 12. Maybe utilizing their NIL a little bit more. I know they've had some decent years recently. But either way, those are some interesting situations to think about. Guys, that's going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.